Welcome back to the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. You can subscribe and stream The Groundless Ground on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, TuneIn, and YouTube. And of course, find out more at groundlessground.com. Richard Hill and Matthew Dalitz have written a comprehensive, definitively modern psychotherapy textbook titled Practitioner's Guide to the Science of Psychotherapy. Their book covers basic neuroscience, body-brain systems, genetic processes, and the application of integrative psychotherapy modalities for anxiety, depression, and trauma, among other mental health disorders. This is the textbook I wished for many years ago when I attended graduate school. I was so excited to dialogue with these two brilliant men about the current sad state of standard psychotherapy and the need for updated curricula and therapist retraining that rests upon scientifically validated patient-responsive treatments. This episode is a rallying cry in support of transforming a psychotherapy profession that fails to adequately meet the needs of so many patients. Richard Hill and Matthew Dalitz, we are about to have a lot of fun doing something very serious that needs to be done in my profession. I so appreciate you being here to talk about your new book, The Practitioner's Guide to the Science of Psychotherapy.
So good to be with you, Lisa.
I must say, and my audience will not be surprised at me saying this, the psychotherapy profession has been training clinicians for decades devoid of science, brain science, neuroscience, the science of the microbiome, the science of the CNS. You took it upon yourselves to fill in the gaps that have been missing and really, I think, have made psychotherapy not very effective for many people.
It goes in the reverse as well, that a lot of science has been taught devoid of the human experience in that. And one of my degrees was in the medicine department of one of our big universities in Sydney in brain and mind sciences. And I went there particularly to fill in my technical knowledge, all the gaps. I became quite infamous, perhaps is the term, because they would be sitting up there describing neurons, describing this, describing that, and talking about psychopharmacology. And I'd put my hand up at some stage, it was inevitable. And I'd say, how is that expressed in the human experience? And then we go the other side where we talk, as you say, in psychotherapy, where people say it's all just about what you see. It's about behavior, it's about emotions, and you assist people in altering those things, and then everything's fine. It's a marriage of those. And we've been seeing the attempts to do this by very creative and intelligent people over the last couple of decades.
I think it's amazing that we've carried on for so long with this separation that you've just described. Well, Richard, this might be a good place to introduce your thoughts about the word science, because science has been one of those words which I think has been a little bit demonized in the world of psychotherapy.
Yeah, we particularly wrote an article in the book release edition, which I hope a lot of people saw in grad, because we had it out there for free for quite a while. What is this word science? Science has become something of reducing and removing all the confounding factors, getting down to something that is reproducible. Humans are not necessarily reproducible in their complete experience. In the earlier years, science was the knowledge of, the seeking of the understanding of. And so it was always an outpouring from philosophy. Science is this wondrous word which has been stolen. It is really important when people talk about science that they talk about science as the understanding of the connection of things, as different from what it's been done, which is the disconnecting of things so that you can control it.
When we say that we've written a book about the science of psychotherapy, this is what we're referring to. It's the knowledge of. We haven't written a how-to book, which has been all the rage for a number of decades. It's probably difficult to couch a book about the knowledge of the human condition in terms of a how-to book. It doesn't work. This is a difficulty that we've come across with therapists. We hear that they don't have enough time to learn about the human condition, which sounds kind of crazy. But they say, well, it's wonderful what you and Richard have been doing, but really, I don't have enough time to dive into all of this. And I wonder, if you went to a cardiologist for some surgery on your heart, and he did his studies back in 1964, and he hasn't had time to, look at any other thing since then, you'd probably be looking for another cardiologist.
This idea of what knowledge does to you, it's the springboard for creative emergence.
I feel like the two of you are minimizing what you have done. And maybe nobody has said this to you before. I feel this is a very powerful how-to book in terms of how to view your patient as a complex system. And this is what psychotherapists do not learn. They do not have the capacity unless you do what I did in my training, which was literally go everywhere else during my training a couple of decades ago and learn the disciplines that I needed to understand how a human being is a complex system, how what looks like only mentation, only dysregulation in the brain or the mind is actually being bottom up affected by a slew of other kinds of diseases in the physical system, environmental factors. And what I feel you've done is you have fully elucidated for therapists how to look at brain fundamentals, how to include bodily systems along with brain functioning, to include genetic factors as well as systemic factors that even medicine right now is really starting to take seriously. The autonomic nervous system functioning, the microbiome functioning, all these things that's medicine is finally saying, oh yes, this has an impact. And your experience definitely has an impact on those things. This is what psychotherapy has been missing. I encourage everybody to know this is a place you can go and get it all and not get it in a way where you feel like you have to go somewhere else to really understand each of these disciplines. Am I wrong?
No. If this is a how-to book, it's how to be a better therapist. We talk about the effectiveness of therapy. 87% is to do with the client resources, and it's about the client, not about the therapeutic technique. Probably could say the same about the therapist. There's only a very small percentage of effectiveness in the therapist that has to do with actually a technique. The majority of the effectiveness is exactly what you've done. Years of research and study of the human condition across disciplines. It becomes part of your intuition. For Richard and I, we're not experts in any one of these areas, but we know a lot about all of these areas. And as we know more about these areas, it becomes ingrained in our intuitive sensitivity.
Throughout the book, we have a separate little box saying clinical notes. This is how you interpret that information into your experience. And of course, we give lots of case studies. It's very valuable that you've just shifted us in that direction, particularly talking about complex systems. It's in the introduction to the book. Now, I was very blessed to be mentored and apprenticed with the great Ernest Rossi. It was terribly important not just to understand complex systems because it's a different thing and there's linear systems. It's an entirely different way of thinking. So when you're approaching a cause-effect type situation and remembering that in all complex systems, there are multitudes of cause-effect elements occurring, but they're cause-effect elements recurring within something else. A complex system is looking for overall principles. It's looking for organizing principle, the orientation and framework and context. And it's looking for what emerges rather than what you can change or make change. And it's looking for surprise, unexpected results. I call it thinking in the system. Everybody can limit themselves, but everybody is in the system. And Einstein said it, you are not just the observer, you are the observer and the subjective experiencer at the same time.
Richard just said just about being in silos. I think this is something that is just too common in our field in psychotherapy, where we're in silos. We go to conferences, we read books, all within the particular therapeutic philosophy and techniques that we use. We can be consumed by that. That's where, like I was saying earlier, a lot of clinicians don't seem to have any time to look outside those silos when they do have time to do some extra reading or research. And I would just encourage people to just open themselves up to be a lot more broad. I was just been reading a book on cellular communication, and a lot of therapists might think, well, what's cellular communication have to do with psychotherapy? Well, actually, quite a lot.
Did you know that insults to the skin can actually autonomically, meaning from the skin, trigger your cortisol production? And it literally could be because they've had too much time in the sun. They've got sunburn because their system is going into an autonomic nervous system response. And that is translated and transferred into the brain through hormones, through peptides, through the vagus nerve, through a whole series of elements, through inflammatory processes. And then we have the thing that brings our attention to the fact that something is happening and we need to act, and that is our emotional response.
You mentioned the microbiome earlier. Understanding that there is a certain mix in the microbiome that can cause chronic inflammation, which then has a knock-on effect and could, manifest as depression. If we're just aware, we don't need to be microbiologists, to understand all of the intimate details of it, but we can have an awareness that this is one variable, this is one area that could be investigated. And without that superficial knowledge, then we would be blind to that variable. We wouldn't send our client to a naturopath or a doctor to investigate the microbiome. So as a family, we actually did these tests, saw correlations between what was missing or what we had too much of in terms of the microbiome. And since going through that process now, when I'm talking to fellow psychotherapists, I say, well, don't forget, if there's, these symptoms and these symptoms, maybe you could, get them to do a microbiome test and just see if there's anything there. It's worth doing because you could do a lot of talk therapy, but if it could be fixed by fixing the gut microbiome, then that's a shortcut.
It's not a disruption in mental processes that is caused by experience. It's actually a disruption in mental processes that is being caused by bodily dysfunction. And the disruption in mental processes are there to trigger your awareness. And that is why one of the fundamental things, and there's several fundamental things we ask, what's your sleep, what's your exercise, and what's your diet? If we hear someone talking to us and they have a horrendous diet, well, the microbiome is one of the things that needs to come up in your awareness, if not your direct attention.
Absolutely.
And you can get these feedback loops happening as well. So, you can have an upset gut microbiome, which is causing some low-grade chronic inflammation, which is causing depression. That depression creates more of the same disruption in your entire system.
Yeah, I would say in general, at least with my patient population, which they all have complex diagnoses, I find it's not one thing ever. It's this combination of difficulties in the system that certainly could have antecedents in one particular area of the system. But by the time they get to me, there's such a history already of slights and difficulties in the system that naming one thing rarely works. Very happy that you guys decided you wanted to highlight some of the work by Scott Miller, who for 30 years has been looking at effectiveness. And you have these great charts in the book, the common factors of the things that could influence good psychotherapy, what percentage of categories is really influencing. And the one you have in your book, Theory and the Technique, literally it's only 15%, supposedly. Another 15% is their expectancy. If they really think this is going to work for them, great. It'll work for them. It's somewhat like placebo. 30% is the therapeutic alliance. If you don't have it, not much is going to happen. And 40% actually are these, you call them extra therapeutic, but I would say environmental conditions. How do they get their support and how much does their life support the process? And when I looked at this chart, the first thing I thought of was this research probably was done with therapists who were doing CBT or talk therapy only. Neither of those things are systemic in any way, shape, or form. These are not systemic methods. By the time I was finished with the textbook you've written, I literally called into question these charts. And I thought to myself, well, in 20 years, maybe if we have therapists who are better trained and more systemic in what they do, it's possible that chart may look different.
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that what the therapist is doing is got a broader range of possibility of creating a change, and that the impact will be greater from the therapist. But what's interesting is that when you think in systems, a very small comparative chart-wise impact of, let's say the therapist is only 5% of the necessary requirements. When you think in systems, that 5% can have a massive effect, as different from when you think in causal, where that 5% is only going to have 5% outcome. I agree with you that those charts need to be taken in the context of the fact of what they're relating it to. But the most important thing from those is that it is what the client possesses that is the resource from which resolution is going to be developed and made. Do a chapter at the very end of the book, we're looking at future theories, which Scott's got a section there. But it's an area of what I call client responsiveness, and that this is the next movement in therapy. I think this is what a lot of people are already doing. They're looking to see what it is that is the client's capacity, and we hinted at it in solution-focused type of ideas. We've been hinting at this thing and sort of stabbing at it from different angles. The task of the therapist, as Erickson said, was to shift the burden of responsibility for effective therapy back to the client. So what's the therapist doing? The therapist is there to help the client recognize. So you're there to recognize their functions and dysfunctions and to respond to them in such a way that you can move the client towards a pathway that is actually coherent for them. No single therapy is correct for everyone. Why isn't CBT just something you can do for everyone and they get better? Well, of course, we've addressed that as we're talking about linear thinking as different from complex systems thinking. And as you're saying, Lisa, it can be 10 different things. The beautiful thing about a system is if it's got 10 things going wrong, you can just change one of them, and that will have a cascading dynamic positive effect to pull the system together. Equally, you can have one thing going wrong, such as a single traumatic experience, and that can cause a cascade of activity, so much so that now Stephen Porges is actually talking about that the whole issue, it's great to know all about the vagus nerve, but what we're dealing with, he says, is a dysautonomia, is that when the autonomic nervous system doesn't know how to function successfully. So what it does is it finds a successful way to function unsuccessfully so that you don't die. Essence of what I would love to see it is an understanding of this co-creative experience between two people that are seeking to find that coherent homeostasis that enables the person to function and move towards that well-being, which I think is the natural state. It's the state that we prefer to be in.
So we do have psychiatrists and we have medical doctors that are interested in what we're saying. And when it comes to psychiatry and psychopharmacology, the impact there can be completely different to what we've just been describing in terms of client resources. We talked to a Dr. Quinn recently who knows about bipolar disorder and the negative effects of antidepressants, a kind of a knee-jerk reaction from psychiatry to deal with depression. Someone who has bipolar disorder is to give them one of the stock standard antidepressants. Well, that actually has a negative impact, and that negative impact is quite huge.
Here in America, if a psychiatrist gives someone they suspect is bipolar an antidepressant, they're giving it to them to see if they're bipolar because they have a negative effect. Here, they're doing that for a reason. Even in America, I think what's happening right now is low dose lithium is actually being shown to be much more effective for depression and bipolar disorder.
Using an antidepressant like that is a pretty blunt instrument.
but we don't know what we're doing because it's a complex system. So we have to investigate, we have to experiment, we have to test. But what's interesting is while we're doing that, the client's psychosocial biological system is also utilizing all these shifts and changes and experiments and tests to self-organize itself towards recovery.
When it comes to psychopharmacology, the dynamics are completely different, obviously. And for psychotherapists, it would pay to understand what is going on in that world, because often we're working in tandem, with a psychiatrist, with drug intervention, to understand what creates change. When it comes to some heavy drugs, people with psychosis and that sort of thing, we need to understand that the drug trumps anything else that we're trying to do.
And we address some psychopharmacology in the book as well.
Maybe I can mention PANS, PANDAS, and a bit of a personal story. So our youngest son, around 12 years of age, started having OCD kind of behavior, and he quickly deteriorated into unable to control his motor movements. He was moving all the time. He became extremely aggressive, angry. There were bouts of days where he just couldn't stop jumping and twisting and turning and yelling. And this went on and on. We went to a number of psychologists and then psychiatrists who said it was some sort of psychiatric disorder, some sort of psychosis. He was put on antipsychotics, antidepressants, things to suppress the activity. There were times when he just wanted to die. It was that bad. And then someone suggested that we talk to a particular pediatrician in Sydney, who then referred us to a neurologist in Sydney, who said, I think I know what's going on. We flew down, we had one meeting with him. He said, yep, this is PANDAS. I'm taking him off all the drugs. I'm just going to give him this antibiotic. And literally overnight, the symptoms stopped. It was a miracle. What is amazing to me, the dynamics of pharmacology, antidepressants, the antipsychotics, Valium, none of that dealt with the problem. But one very simple antibiotic killed this thing, knocked it on the head. And of course, we didn't realize we're looking at an autoimmune disorder. According to the psychiatrist, it was a purely psychiatric disorder. It was all in his head. But no, it was actually killer T cells, Th17, getting into his brain and messing with his dopaminergic receptors, creating an abundance of dopamine. Now, armed with this knowledge, and I've shared this so many times with different people who have had kids that have these sort of symptoms. Quite often, when they do start to investigate PANS, PANDAS, they find actually that's what's going on. And now there's tests and that have been developed that can be very definitive. And then, of course, the treatment is not easy, but it's relatively simple compared to trying to deal with a psychiatric disorder.
Very often, tick-borne diseases can give rise to similar kinds of psychiatric symptoms, including memory loss. Chris Christopherson is not the only person in America who suddenly had tremendous symptoms of dementia and was finally put on antibiotics, the right ones for tick-borne disease. This, again, drives home the point of the book that you've written, which is when a therapist has a view that is more systemic, they can ask questions, guide the therapy so that it's including a wider range of questions and other kinds of clinicians like your experience. And I would also say that for me, any therapist who thinks that they are the change maker really needs another profession. Nothing happens that the patient doesn't do themselves.
Yeah.
Every therapy that exists, like CBT was not invented by Aaron Beck, and EMDR was not invented by Francine Shapiro, and it was observed as a human mental health mechanism. They investigated it and expanded its detail and found ways to successfully implement it. This is what's talked about in complex systems. Prigionide said that you differentiate the elements so you can explore their potentials that are unseen when they're all collected in the emergent property. We understand that almost all therapies are potentially resident in the client. The quality of those and the quantity of those is dependent upon their life experience. But if you're watching a client and you're experiencing co-creating with them, they will shift into a bit of cognitive work, behavioral stuff, somatic stuff. They might close their eyes and their eyes might start to move back and forward as in EMDR. All these elements of what is good for them, but then also what's missing, they are actually telling you the sorts of therapy that they are most attuned to respond to. And if you attune to that, you're amplifying attuned responsiveness that really, I think, a lot of therapists are now saying is the way they work. And that's a beautiful thing to see.
When we think about sleep hygiene, diet, exercise, social connectivity, we can boil a lot of the complexity down to some very simple principles. So let's just take diet. We've been rather divorced from our intuitive sensitivity to what is good for us in terms of diet. But if we can come back to what our body is really telling us, we might be able to come to a place where we can modulate our gut biome by what we're eating, because we're becoming more sensitive to what our body needs. We just need maybe some guidance to come into that place of sensitivity. Sleep hygiene, there's a lot of education around that, and we can become more sensitive to what our bodies in terms of sleep. Same with moving our body and exercise. And then, of course, the whole social connectivity aspect, which is probably where most of the focus is around about in psychotherapy. And that, of course, includes epigenetic forces and what our history has brought forward epigenetically. My point is that we're looking at an extremely complex system for our own mental health. We can reduce it to a number of key lifestyle.
Yeah, it's what we call organizing principles, and which, of course, is what we try to explain early on in the book. Complex systems, I find them easier to work with than almost than linear ones when you think in the system. It's only when you're trying to control the system that you get into all kinds of trouble. As you say, when the therapist tries to be the cause of the client's recovery.
I think a good example of what we're talking about, for a very long time, if a patient came and they had a quote unquote anxiety disorder, they would be given an anxiolytic, which of course we know are addictive. And I can't tell you how many patients, doctors, and psychiatrists have sent to me to get off of them because they're hard to get off. Yeah. However, one of the things I've been seeing that some of my psychiatric colleagues are now doing is giving an alpha blocker. And it's tremendously interesting, the positive impact that just taking an alpha blocker has on the autonomic nervous system capacity to do the kind of regulatory tasks that it needs in daily life. And then also I find it's very helpful in the room when I'm actually working with specifically doing autonomic nervous system regulation using somatic experiencing and some of the other things that I've been trained in. It helps me to feel a little more competent and confident about how medicine can be a partner to my patients.
We're learning a lot about heart rate variability and the balance of the autonomic nervous system. And then out of that, we have these more subtle interventions that are proving better than the big club.
I loved the section on the intracardiac system. I don't actually think I've seen anyone lay it out quite like that.
Oh, thank you. Matt and I have been doing this now for over a decade. We would have these discussions constantly. And it was so great that we got to write the book because we've been talking about it for so long. When we found our discussions were sparking, we'd go, oh, now I think we're talking about it in a way that has some comfort and clarity.
One of the difficulties in writing the book, because of the constraints of the size of the book, you can only fit so much in. Richard and I have been saying, well, maybe this is volume 1, to really say we're encapsulating all of the things that we are finding interesting and we should know about. We need a number of volumes to cover it all. Maybe that's in the future.
But one of the things I wanted to just add to enrich the conversation we were just having about symptoms, what we're dealing with, when you think in the system, you realize that the system will self-organize and it will send outward into the awareness. Something will emerge out into the conscious awareness and experience that is reflective of or is in result of all the things that are going on. And very often what emerges is not even directly related to what is going on within. For example, you can look at a whole system and not be able to see its parts. And you can look at a part and not be able to imagine its eventual outcome. For example, you look at a human being, it's very difficult to imagine a liver. And if you look at a liver, it's very difficult to imagine a human being coming out of that. But our conscious awareness, actually, we're having a conversation with Joseph Ledoux in a couple of weeks about consciousness. And our conscious awareness is a mechanism that we've developed over evolutionary time to stimulate us to take an action. And our conscious awareness is fairly blunt. So our symptoms are fairly blunt. And I like to use the example that 3 times a day, and there's about an hour and a half of about 30 processes that occur in the body that eventually emerges a strong enough stimulus to pop into our conscious awareness, I'm hungry. Now that just stimulates you and creates a self-directed action. The prefrontal cortex then says, you should get up and go to the fridge and get something to eat. We also get depressed. Now that depression is not the problem. That's just the message. So what's depression about? What's it telling us? Ernie had a wonderful term for it. He called it the symptom path to enlightenment. The symptom is actually giving us directions and pointing to us, but it's doing it in a very blunt, uncomfortable way. And you can overcome the depression, take an antidepressant, but the depression is informing us about brain functions, bodily actions, what might be happening in the immune system. It's actually inviting us to go and find out how these things work so that we can explore what is going on in the inner world.
For me, that all boils down to working smarter, not harder. I have faith in the system. It knows how to head toward healing.
You do belong here in Silicon Valley. That is a saying that I think came from here.
Yeah. We're learning so much all the time.
Question everything. That is the crux of really excellent psychotherapy. Be open to everything without your assumptions.
You know, we were talking about pandas before, and many of the professionals we went to, they were stuck in a particular theoretical position. They didn't question beyond what they already knew. That was just, okay, it looks like this, it has to be this. But no, that wasn't the answer. As a family, well, we had to stand back and start questioning and asking more questions. And even though we didn't happen upon the answer ourselves, we were directed to other experts that did know. In terms of psychotherapy, we've had Louis Cozolino tell us, look, anything, only believe half of it because half of it will be wrong in 5 years' time. I just can't tell you which half. Isn't that so true? As we're learning so much about neurobiology, especially, there's revelations every week coming out. Some of them are turning everything that we used to know on its head. Yeah, we have to hold on to our pet theories very lightly. So there's a good chance that half of what you believe today is not going to hold true in 5 years' time.
This is what Ernie Rossi was banging on about. What's next? What's more? What's beyond the growing edge? It is difficult because our comfort zone is a nice place to be. It also gives us the capacity to give some degree of prediction to a reasonable percentage of our cases. And there was a particular group I was working with. If they could get 70 to 75% positive response rate, they were kind of saying, well, the other 25%, well, they're just too hard. It's not our fault was one of the things that they said. They need to be somebody else's responsibility. Certainly there are maybe 75% of the people we work with have a less complex or a less complicated pathway to resolving their issues. But it's that very difficult group who have this multitude of elements of even when you resolve one or two of them, those other ones are still causing other problems. That, I think, is one of the big issues that we try to deal with in the book. We say, are you really okay about becoming aware of all this stuff? Because you realize that this is going to challenge your standard practice. And I think that we need to challenge standard practice because we need to make changes.
When clinicians have more knowledge and they have more breadth, the best thing they can do is realize what is out of their scope of practice, what they can and cannot do. So that 25%, in my experience, here in America, mostly people will use the term BPD as a curse word. Oh, they're just borderline. And frankly, I am not a big believer in the diagnosis. To me, this is basically a trauma response, and it's the way that they have learned how to function because of very early developmental traumatic experience that was chronic. If you don't know that, if you don't have that view, you're going to see the person as unworkable. These people are anything but unworkable. They're incredibly interesting, usually. And if you give them a different view other than you're broken and you can't have relationships, it's a good thing for clinicians to have a better sense of what is their lane and what isn't, so that they don't have 25% who aren't responding.
And that's so important. One of the things we found, particularly in the documentary work, this element of delusion and hallucination and that area of the brain can be entirely unseen and unrecognized. I use some examples of that in the book to say to people, you could do lots and lots and lots of very nice emotional therapy, but you actually are now dealing with a brain that functions differently. That 25% is not the 25% you fix because you've read our book. It's the 25% that you recognize because you've read our book and then are able to help them by referring.
We have to get away from our fixation on DSM, diagnostic criteria. And there's a whole nother podcast there, isn't there?
Well, Thomas Insel basically said the DSM is useless.
I was talking with someone who's been diagnosed with schizophrenia the other day, and when you really get to hear his story, he's suffering from PTSD from a traumatic event at work, and he has some symptoms that you could tick off in the diagnostic criteria in the DSM, but really there's no neat fitting into this diagnostic criteria of schizophrenia. That's common. There's all of these overlap. There's continuums in all of these psychological disorders.
One that we interviewed, such an interesting interview. She is clearly delusional and has audio hallucinations. And what she says, though, is, that's all right. I've worked that out. I just now know the difference between the voices I should listen to and the voices I shouldn't listen to. And fundamentally, my voices tell me that what we should all be doing is coming together and becoming one as human beings. So I now go out into society and I work with groups to try and help them come together and integrate and engage. Her schizophrenia is actually the very mechanism that is making her a godsend to a lot of people in her community. I go back and I've listened to this interview now several times because she's inspiring.
Coming back to DSM, we don't be fooled into thinking that just because you know the diagnostic criteria as dictated by the DSM, that you actually know the disorder.
And having said that, we do describe some of the DSM characteristics in the book so that people can become aware of what the DSM is saying.
Because the reason why the DSM came about in the first place was to create a common language for researchers to be able to talk to each other so they knew what each other was saying. Initially, it was never meant to be a diagnostic tool.
There's something that I think you guys might be able to elucidate really super well, since everybody is into quoting neuroscience and brain function. I was curious if either one of you would like to riff on the fact that talking about function of separate brain areas really doesn't work. It's better to talk about networks.
Yes, talking about individual brain regions. It's interesting in terms of if you're a researcher in a narrow field looking at something to do with the language or motor regions of the brain. But in terms of practical psychotherapy, we talk about the default mode network, the executive network in the brain, a network of different regions that light up at the same time. It's probably even better to think about the entire nervous system. And even more now that we're learning more about the wisdom, the complexity of cellular activity. It's the whole body. We really have to go all out and just say the whole body, the whole interaction from microtubules and possibly the quantum communication networks right through to the larger heart-brain connections, gut-brain connections, skin-brain-heart connections. It's indivisible.
You differentiate the elements to discover their potential, but only to then put that back into the system so you understand the system.
We could be talking about the default mode network in terms of creativity, and we can isolate the conversation around the default mode network within the cranium. But really, you can't divorce that from what's happening in the heart brain and its connection with the default mode network. But then you can't really divorce that from beyond the body and what's happening electromagnetically. There's solar radiation effects. There's effects between people within a certain distance from the electromagnetic forces of the heart. in training someone else's brain and vice versa. And so everything's connected. I don't want to sound too new age, but it's true.
Use the word intersubjectivity and not sound new agey.
And this is the stuff that Ernie and I were working with in the final years. Everything is constantly expressing in a dynamic flow.
We're discovering more and more now that things like entanglement, we used to have this idea that entanglement was only subatomic particles, then larger objects. Now demonstrated entanglement between two crystalline structures. We're moving up the scale of size. There's no reason to doubt that entanglement can have an effect in the macro world. And then when you start thinking about that, that just blows your mind. That just opens up so much.
It does. And Ernie and I would sit there and say, oh, what can we create with this? We were excited about what we knew, but constantly looking for where it took us and constantly realizing that we were standing on potential sand and not solid.
To bring this to a close is the way you brought the book to a close, mentioning the coming together of two things I find critical for good psychotherapy: engaged practice and dynamic curiosity, delivering a set of skills to a patient so that they can do engaged practice with their symptomology, with their life, and be dynamically curious about the whole thing. And I was extremely happy that this is the way you ended your book.
Thank you. Dynamic curiosity is actually largely my work, where we've again hijacked this word curiosity to just being this investigative process. Information is what we're after in one part of curiosity, and we do it by investigation, but we also do it by play, by unregulated engagement. But the third curiosity, which I think has been relegated to philosophy, is a curiosity for meaning, because that information, until it becomes self-relevant, is kind of useless or not useful, and it isn't productive. Insight is the shift of unrelevant information into relevant and purposeful information, and that suddenly creates a burst of creativity. That creativity is what changes us, shifts us, and the final process of just simply implementing that activity, that creativity, those new possibilities that have been turned from possibility into actuality, are the nature of successful recovery and resolution of disturbance and disintegration within a system that doesn't want to be just surviving, it wants to be thriving.
And can I just encourage people to, this is meant to be a fun ride. Being curious and diving into all of these things. Don't be intimidated by the breadth of what there is to know. And we're certainly not suggesting everyone needs multiple master's degrees in all of these different areas. This is a very exciting time to be in the field of mental health because we are discovering so many cool things. This is an exciting ride. Become curious, learn lots.
The two of you are contributing something to that effort that I don't think I have ever seen in our field. And I know many of the people that you've named throughout our interview, and yet I really have to say the digestibility of the information in the book is done so tremendously well. And I really don't want anyone to feel like they can't digest this material, because you've done a superlative job of not dumbing down, but making it extremely approachable. And I cannot thank you enough.
We spent years doing this. I'm a bit teary, actually.
For anyone that's interested in going even further than the book, the Science of Psychotherapy platform, our academy, where we jump into many more areas as well, but with the same idea. This is an exciting journey of curiosity. And again, it's like you said earlier, how to be a better therapist by knowing about all of these things.
So the website is thescienceofpsychotherapy.com, and I will have links to the book as well as to the website on the show notes. I cannot thank you enough for spending this time with me, and also for reaching out to me. Truly happy that you reached out. Thank you.
It was wonderful. Nice to be virtually in Silicon Valley.
Yes. What other ways there to be in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks for listening to today's show.
To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.